Welcome back to the Illumination Lectures. And today we're talking about the Jewish Revolt, the revolt of AD 66 to AD 70. Again, taken from my book King Jesus, which is a comprehensive tour of the alternative evidence that can be found about gospel events. And there's an awful lot of that if you know where to look, what to look for, and if you look deeply enough. So why look at the Jewish revolt? I mean, we're researching the life and times of the biblical Jesus here. So why look at the Jewish revolt of AD 66? Well, it's my contention, as I have said before, that the gospel stories are all about the Jewish revolt. And that's what we want to look at and what we want to prove, I suppose. Because we know that Jesus was involved in a revolt, probably the Jewish revolt, because the Gospels tell us so. And this is from the Gospel of Mark, and it says that Jesus was a revolutionary. It says, "And there was one named Barabbas, which lay bound with them, that had made revolution with him, who had committed murder in the revolution." So what revolution was that in the AD 30s? There was no such revolution that we know of. Well, it's my contention, and this will be proven, that this was the Jewish revolt. And that gives us a problem with the chronology. But we've seen this problem before. I've called it the chronological chasm, where events that are supposed to be taking place in the AD 30s actually take place in the AD 60s. And we'll see more evidence of this later. But how was this chronology changed? How did events that happened in the AD 60s become put back into the AD 30s? Well, this was through Josephus Flavius, the chief historian and propaganda minister of the Romans. And Josephus Flavius had been given a commission by Emperor Vespasian to write a history of the Jewish revolt. And his great work was known as Bellum, the Jewish War. And here is a title page from his full works, I think this is. What's it titled? It's The Famous and Memorable Works of Josephus. 1640 edition, this one. So this is a venerable work that all theologians will be quite familiar with. And so they will be as familiar with these topics that we're going to discuss as I am. So why give Josephus this task? This is Vespasian. Why did Vespasian give Josephus this great task to write the Chronicle of the Jewish Revolt? Well, because he was working for the Romans at the time, and he was greatly interested in Jewish history. And he was given the scrolls from the Temple of Jerusalem after it was destroyed in AD 70. And Josephus says of this, when the city was taken by force, Titus Caesar persuaded me to take whatsoever I could from the ruins of my country. I also had the holy books from the temple by Titus's concession. So Josephus was writing a history of the Jews using original temple scrolls. So his Josephus' sources were much older than any modern Torah. His sources went back to 600 BC rather than 1000 AD, which is about the earliest Torah that is extant today. And so Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews, which is his own sort of personal version of the Torah, is more historical and less fanciful than the actual Torah. And it gives us new perspectives on biblical events. Differences like, Josephus will say that the Israelites were actually Egyptians themselves, which is an interesting story that we will look at in later lectures. And so Josephus was the perfect medium for writing this account of the Jewish revolt in the AD 60s. But of course, his Jewish war covers the whole of the first century. So we have a whole history of first century Judea and the Roman influences on Judea for the whole of the first century. And this is an image of Josephus. This bust is in Denmark, and the museum says there is no evidence that this is actually a bust of Josephus Flavius, but this is often thought of as what sort of Josephus Flavius would have looked like, because he was a Romophile, and therefore he would have been clean-shaven and short-haired in this sort of fashion. So, Josephus was a historian and a leader of simple Judaism, because he was Saul Josephus, as we've looked at before. And possibly he was the chief rabbi and prime minister after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, and the leader of the Jews. Well, Governor Lucius Silva was probably the governor of Judea in the AD 70s, but Saul Josephus was their spiritual leader after the fall of Jerusalem. And so he was in a position to rewrite all of Judaism. I mean, he had the ear of the emperor. He had the commission to write from the emperor. And he did rewrite Judaism. We know there was animal sacrifice in the early first century because the Talmud and the Gospels say so. So why was this venerable tradition ended? The reason is that Saul Josephus was the leader of simple Judaism, and Saul Josephus did not adhere to Mosaic law, and nor did he keep kosher. And likewise, Jesus, the biblical Jesus, drove the animals out of the temple, if you remember, and these were sacrificial animals, because Jesus was against the roast sacrifice tradition. And here is Jesus driving out the moneylenders and the animals from the Temple of Jerusalem. This is by Valentin. And what's missing from this? Well, there are no animals. So let's have a look at another artist's impression of this. This is Sasolino. And again, where are the animals? There is a cow right at the back there. It's as if they're trying to take the Judaism out of Jesus to pretend that there was no animal sacrifice in this era. But there was, we know there was. So the Gospels are portraying this, this conflict as a class war, Jesus against the bankers driving out the moneylenders from the temple. Well, yes, it was a tax dispute in some respects and a land dispute, and we'll look at that in a minute. But it was also a sectarian conflict. It was the Nazarene Gnostics against the Orthodox Jews in the temple. And the Nazarene sacrificed their hair, not animals, and they offered incense, not roast meat. So there was a big sectarian divide here, and that's what this driving the animals out of the temple was all about, because both Jesus and Saul Josephus did not agree with animal sacrifice. And they obviously won this particular dispute, because if you go to a synagogue today, you will not see a line of animals outside waiting to be slaughtered. So there was a big change in Judaism at this time, which was engineered by Saul Josephus. And Saul Josephus's own history, his secular history of the Jewish revolt, has similar distortions within it, because he was writing Roman propaganda more than he was history. So there are no real Jewish heroes within his Jewish revolt, apart from himself, of course. because they've all been airbrushed from the Chronicle. Josephus's Jewish war was a Roman history, not a Jewish history. It was there to praise Rome and to denigrate or conceal the enemies of Rome. And the leaders of the Jewish revolt, we'll look at this in a minute, but the leaders of the Jewish revolt were Jesus of Gomorrah and the kings of Edessa. But the kings of Edessa have been deleted and obscured. So much so now that if you look through the works of Josephus, you will not see one mention of Edessa in the whole of the works of Josephus. So there is a lot of obfuscation here. There's a lot of concealment. So Josephus Flavius's Jewish war is merely one facet of the real truth, and the other histories were intentionally deleted. One of those deleted histories was called, and we know this from other writers, it was called the Chronology of the Kings of Judah, which succeeded one another by Justus of Tiberias. And Photius says of this history of the Jews, I have read the chronology of Justus of Tiberias. Justus came out of the city of Tiberias in Galilee, and he begins his history from the time of Moses and ends it not until the death of Agrippa II. And this is Agrippa II here, and he died at the end of the 1st century. So here was another complete history of the Jews and the kings of the Jews, all the way from the era of Moses to the end of the 1st century. The trouble being is this history is missing. And we don't really know who Justus of Tiberias really was. He obviously came from Tiberias, and he knew King Agrippa II quite well, and his sister wife Berenice or Berenike. But remember, the governor of Tiberias was called Jesus of Gomorrah, that same name again that keeps cropping up, who was the leader of the Jewish Revolt. And his brother's name was James Justus, which is a very similar name. So it's quite possible, and I think it's quite reasonable to assume, that Justus of Tiberias, who wrote this alternative history, was linked in some manner to Jesus of Gomorrah and the rebels who started the Jewish Revolt. Anyway, Josephus Flavius says of this chronicle, the Chronicle of Justice, when Justus undertook to write about the Jewish war, he falsified in what he related about me, and could not speak the truth even about his own country. O Justus, thou most wise of writers, you boast that I and the Galileans have been the authors of the revolt. But it is written in the commentaries of Emperor Vespasian that you were an instigator of the revolt and should be brought to punishment. Interesting. So the blame game has been started here. Justus of Tiberias is blaming Josephus for the Jewish revolt, and Josephus is blaming Justus of Tiberias, which probably means that both of them were equally involved. But Justus of Tiberias's chronicle had an opposing perspective that could have given us the other side of the story, if only we had a copy of his chronicle, but obviously it's gone by now. Interestingly, the church leaders, Eusebius and Ellis, they had copies of this chronicle. But since that time, I mean, this is 3rd, 4th century, since that time it has been deleted or hidden, and we no longer have copies of it. Which, as I said before, is a shame, because this would be a new alternate version of the Old and New Testaments. And if we had had that copy, then we would have had a version which was the biblical version, We would have had Josephus's version, his Antiquities, which is his own version of the Old and New Testaments. And we would have had Justus's version. And with three separate viewpoints and perspectives, we might have derived something approaching the truth. But we don't really have that liberty anymore. Unfortunately, that's not available to us. However, what I did find in this research is probably the next best thing, which is the Chronicle of Moses of Corinne. And this is a Syrian text, which was hidden behind the divisions of the Council of Chalcedon for over 1,500 years. And although this chronicle is fragmentary, it did allow another perspective on first century events. And it allowed me to discover the biblical Jesus in the historical record. But more on that later, because at this time I didn't know about Moses of Corinne's chronicle. So laying that chronicle to one side for a minute, what does Josephus Flavius say about the leader of the Jewish Revolt? Well, as we've already seen, he was the leader of the fourth sect Galileans, and his name was Jesus. Jesus of Gomorrah, the governor of Tiberias, the guy we've just linked to Justus of Tiberias, whose chronicle has gone missing. And here he is. This is Jesus of Gomorrah. And you'll have to have a look at my talk on the Hukuk mosaic to see why this is Jesus of Gomorrah, because the archaeologists erroneously said this was Alexander the Great, which is simply laughable. Anyway, the Talmud says that this is Bar Kemza. But long, long ago, I had already said, more like 15, 20 years ago, I had already said that Bar Kemza was the leader of the Jewish Revolt, and I had identified him with Jesus of Gomorrah. So that identification was made long before this mosaic was discovered. And strangely enough, my image of Jesus of Gomorrah, which is on the left here, looks exactly like the one I predicted. So the one I designed is on the left here, which I made in 2010. And on the right is the mosaic image of the same person, which was only discovered in 2018. And as you can see, they are rather similar. They both have ginger hair and a beard. They both have straight noses, a diadema headband. You can see the blue tassels hanging from the back of the crown there. And they both have a purple cloak fastened with a circular fibula. They are pretty much one and the same person, which was a nice confirmation that what I'd been saying about Jesus of Gomorrah was all correct. And perhaps you're wondering why you've not really heard of Jesus of Gomorrah before. Because this guy was the leader of the Jewish Revolt, which is the greatest event in modern Judaism. And so, why do you not hear about him? Well, I think it's probably because his life is too similar to the life of the biblical Jesus. And so he doesn't really get a mention, even though he's a very important character within this first century dispute. So what was this Jewish revolt all about? Well, we've seen it was a sectarian dispute about roast sacrifice and Mosaic law and kosher regulations. But there was also the problem of Roman occupation of Judea and Israel and Syria. And so there was this tax dispute with Rome. The Babylonian Jews, you remember from lecture 1, I think it was, where we talked about the Babylonian Jews who came out of Babylon and settled in Syria. And that was the basis of the nativity story. Well, these Babylonian Jews were promised their lands tax-free, both by Herod and by Octavian. But now the Romans wanted to tax them. They'd gone back on their word. And in addition, these Babylonian Jews, because they were now Jews, and they claimed the whole of Judea and Israel as being their homeland. And this land was now occupied by Romans. And that was a part of the dispute as well. And if that wasn't bad enough, then the occupation was getting more and more oppressive. And this is a quote about Florus, who was the Roman governor of Judea from AD 64 to 66. And Josephus says, Florus thought it petty to get money out of single persons. So he stripped whole cities and ruined complete communities. The result was every district was laid waste, and many people left their homes and fled to foreign provinces. So there was oppression and great suffering because of the Roman occupation. And you can just imagine these Judean rebels holed up in caves, perhaps down at Qumran on the shores of the Dead Sea, asking, "What have the Romans ever done for us?" And someone might mention the aqueducts and the irrigation and the sanitation, of course, and the medicine and the wine. And then someone might mention the roads, but of course the roads go without saying. So the seeds of rebellion that we've seen so often before were being sown by Governor Florus in his overtaxation and oppression of the people in Judea and Israel. And the seeds of this rebellion can also be found in the Gospels. This is why the two stories are very similar. And we can see this in the parable of the vineyard owner, which is in Mark. It's in all three synoptic Gospels, but this one is from Mark 12. And Jesus says, "A landowner rented out a vineyard to a tenant, but the tenant refused to pay the landlord any rent. The evil tenant even killed the landlord's representatives. And the landlord said, 'What shall we do with this wicked tenant?' And the people said, 'Well, kill the tenant and give the land to others who will pay their rent.'" And this is supposed to be a painting of the parable of the vineyard owner. So why is Jesus championing the rights of absentee landlords? I mean, Jesus is supposed to be a man of the people, standing up for the poor. So why is Jesus narrating this? And what does it mean? Well, in reality, of course, this is a parable. And parables have double meanings. An overt meaning and a hidden meaning, with the one concealing the other. And in this case, for the hidden meaning, the church will say that the vineyard owner is God and the vineyard itself is Israel. And it's really convoluted and not very convincing as to what the real meaning of this parable is. And the church explanation still doesn't solve the problem of the overt meaning of the parable. And the overt meaning of the parable is still a story about an absentee landlord killing his tenants because they won't pay their rent. How does that square with the biblical pauper prince of peace that Jesus is supposed to be? It doesn't really, does it? So, why is Jesus championing the rights of absentee landlords? Well, in reality, we've just changed the story, haven't we? The real story of the Gospels is a land dispute and a tax dispute, with Rome. And so in reality, the landlord here is Jesus himself. Because these were his lands. He was the governor of Tiberias. He was possibly the king of Edessa. These were his lands. And the tenant who's occupying those lands is the Romans, because they were living in Judea and they were not paying their rent. In fact, not only were they not paying rent, but they were demanding taxes or rent from the landlord. Oh, what sort of tenant would do that? And so what does the parable say you should do? Well, the parable says you should destroy the Romans and give the land to others. And so you can see this is the seeds of the Jewish revolt being sown, right in the middle of the gospel story. And here is that end of the Jewish revolt. This is an image of Jerusalem burning. This is the Jewish revolt, which was one of the greatest revolts within the Roman Empire in all of its history. So this is the real gospel story, the gospel story that's not told very often. It was not a parable about class warfare, the poor against the rich, or in this case it was the rich against the poor, but there we go. This parable, and much of the story of the Gospels themselves, is a story about the Babylonian Jews, or the Edessans, against the Romans. And that was the revolt that Jesus was involved in, and that he was imprisoned because of, as we saw at the beginning of this talk. And do remember that at this time in my research, I had no idea what Edessa was, because it's been deleted from the works of Josephus Flavius. So all I had at this point in my research was the fact that the rebel leaders were called the Babylonian Jews, the fourth sect of Judaism, the Nazarene, the Galileans, the Zealots, and the Sicarii. And what does this have to do with the gospel story? Well, as we can see from this little list here, Jesus was a Nazarene and a Galilean, and the disciples were Zealots and Sicarii. And so we have a direct link here between the rebels of the Jewish revolt and gospel events. And this, together with all the other evidence, is why I say that the gospel is actually recording the Jewish revolt. And so it's another copy, effectively, of Josephus's Jewish War. So Josephus made this huge chronicle of first century events called his Jewish War, which chronicled the Jewish revolt. And the Gospels is simply the same story with fairy dust applied, covered in icing sugar. It's the same story, just made a little bit sweeter. So that is the gospel story. But there was more to this revolt than either the Gospels or Josephus will actually let on about. Because it was not just about taxation and the occupation by the Romans. It was also a battle for the throne of Rome. But again, I did not know that at this time, because you need to know who the Edessan monarchs are before you can discover that. And so we will discuss that in a later lecture. All I knew at this time was that the leaders of the Jewish revolt were Jesus of Gomorrah, who is very, very similar to the biblical Jesus, and the kings of Adiabene, who are a completely unknown monarchy from a completely unknown location, and nobody knows anything about them, so I rather put them to one side for a minute because I could not explain who they were. Luckily, later on, I was managed to fully explain exactly who these people were, which was very satisfying. But I did not know that at this time. So, at this time, we have a revolt against Rome. There was unrest, there was revolution in the air. And the revolt actually started in AD 66, when the Sicarii rebels attacked the Herodian fortress of Masada. And here is an image of Masada. Okay, that's the wrong image. This is the image of Masada, which is on the shores of the Dead Sea, down at the bottom end of the Dead Sea. It's a natural fortress that was fortified by the Herodians. So why did the Sicarii attack a location so far away from the center of Judea? Well, because it held the arsenal of the Herodians, and of course of the Roman governors, who would be Florus at the time. So all of their arms were stored at Masada. So now the rebels were fully armed. And they also seized the banking records in Jerusalem, and they promised to cancel the debts of anyone who joined them, which is real sort of Robin Hood stuff. But I'm sure it works. I'm sure it works. And about the same time, probably a couple of years before this, Jesus of Gomorrah, the leader of the Jewish Revolt, became the high priest of Jerusalem. And so did, of course, the biblical Jesus, as you can read yourself in Hebrews 7. It's quite a long passage, so I won't repeat it here. But the biblical Jesus became the high priest of Jerusalem in Hebrews 7. So they both become the high priest of Jerusalem. And then, in the gospel stories, Jesus is anointed with oil at the house of Simon. And this is quite a pivotal event, although it's downplayed quite a lot within by theologians and within gospel stories. But this is quite pivotal. And the Gospels say, when in Bethany, in the house of Simon, there came a woman having an alabaster box of spikenard, very precious. And she opened the box and poured it on his head, on the head of Jesus, of course. That's from the Gospel of Mark, but John says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany. Mary took a pound of spikenard, very costly, and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. So there's a bit of a difference between the two verses, as we always do see between these Gospels and between these Gospels and other texts. There are always differences between the two. Now, in the first verse, it just says a woman, because it wants to cover up her name, because they didn't really want to admit that people like Mary Magdalene were quite influential within the Church of Jesus and James. So they've deleted her. But the second verse admits that her name was Mary, and it was Mary who anointed Jesus with oil. But which Mary? Well, this is Mary of Bethany, of course, because they are at the house of Simon in Bethany. So this is Mary of Bethany, so it's Mary and Martha, the two sisters. But Mary of Bethany is Mary Magdalene, and that's very easy to see if you compare all of the verses that mention these particular Marys. It is obvious that Mary of Bethany is Mary Magdalene. And we know that in this case because the top verse says that she carried an alabaster jar. And of course, Mary Magdalene always has an alabaster jar. That's her symbol because she anointed Jesus with oil. And you can see this is Mary Magdalene because of her ginger hair, long ginger hair, and she has her green and gold or green and orange tunic. And she has her alabaster jar. Let's step back a little and think about this. This is Mary Magdalene, anointing Jesus as the King of Judea in the early AD 60s. This is what that ceremony that they try and belittle and cover up is all about. This anointing is how you make a king of the Jews. Just as Queen Elizabeth in Britain was anointed at her coronation, so was Jesus being anointed. This is what Jesus' second title actually means. He was called the Christ, which means the Anointed One, the anointed King of the Jews. And he was made the King of the Jews at this ceremony. So Jesus was royal. We've looked at this before. He was a royal prince, and now he's been made a royal king. And he had just been made the anointed King of the Jews. But his coronation and his anointing was not a grand ceremony in Jerusalem, as you might expect. It was at a house of Simon in Bethany. Why? Well, probably because he was a rebel leader. He didn't really have a throne yet to sit on. He couldn't go to Jerusalem and claim that as his own. So he had a private ceremony in a private house in Bethany, which I actually identify as being across the Jordan. It was east of the Jordan in Bethania. And in addition to this, he was anointed as a king by a woman, Mary Magdalene. But when Queen Elizabeth of Britain was anointed, she was anointed by the Archbishop of Canterbury, which rather suggests that Mary Magdalene was the Archbishop, which she probably was. She probably was because Mar in Aramaic often means bishop. So Mar, as in Mary, can also mean bishop. So we can be fairly sure that Mary was aristocratic at least, and probably a princess. And that is sort of confirmed in subsequent books. Things like the Protovangelium of Mary and the Golden Legend, which are both sort of medieval stories about Mary Magdalene, who both say that she was a very rich princess. And even the Rapunzel story, let down your golden hair. We've seen that story in the talk on fairy tales. So yes, remember this particular point, as it's fairly fundamental and quite pivotal. And we're going to talk about this in the next lecture as well. That Jesus was anointed by Mary Magdalene at the house of Simon. And it was at this point that he became the King of the Jews, as the Gospels admit. I think on 36 occasions they call him the King of the Jews. So yes, we're going to look at this again in the next lecture when we look at the history of Mary Magdalene. And so this coronation was a private takeover, as it were, of Judea. A soft coup, you might say. The Jews were leaderless because they were being governed by the Romans. They didn't have a king at all. They needed a Jewish king to lead them. And Mary Magdalene had just given them a king who was descended from the Babylonian Jews, as we saw, who had come to Syria and Judea in AD 4. They were the ones who had descended from Queen Theomusa Aurania, who was an Egypto-Parthian queen, as mentioned in the first lecture on Cleopatra to Christ. So by AD 66, Jesus of Gomorrah was the king of the Jews and the leader of the Jewish Revolt. And so Governor Florus, who was the Roman governor of Judea, was forced to evacuate Jerusalem and go somewhere else. And Jesus took over, although he didn't manage to take over Jerusalem at this time. But the Romans, of course, cannot allow this revolt to succeed. Otherwise, they'll have revolts all over the empire. I mean, the empire depended on the cooperation of the local governors and the local kings all around the empire. to toe the line and be Roman first and whatever their nationality was second. So the Romans couldn't afford to have a revolt in the east succeeding. And so Cestius Gallus, who was the governor of Syria, marches down to Jerusalem with 1 legion, which was not really enough, I suppose. Plus he had the forces of King Sohemus of Emesa and King Agrippa II of Israel. But that gives Cestius a bit of a problem, because Rome liked international forces in their battles. So when they were fighting the Britons or the Picts or something of that nature, they used Scythian and Syrian forces, which ensured that the troops had no conflict of interest in that particular battle. But Agrippa and Sohemus had local troops, and many of them were probably actually Jews. And so we now have a situation of Jews fighting Jews. And so there was an amount of duplicity, you might say, within these conflicted Roman forces. In addition, Jerusalem is a bit of a fortress. These are slightly more recent fortifications, but even in the 1st century, Jerusalem had massive fortifications. And this is another part of the fortifications. This is the Wailing Wall, which is an inner wall within the fortifications in Jerusalem. And you can see the massive nature of some of these walls. It would have been very, very difficult for anyone to easily break into Jerusalem, as Vespasian found when he took up the siege of Jerusalem later. So this attack on Jerusalem by Cestius went very badly, and he was forced to retreat. But the retreat turned into a bit of a rout, and the army of Cestius was decimated. It was an utter defeat for Rome, and the rebels were victorious. And joyous, of course. But if anyone thought that Rome would simply walk away from Judea, they were simply deluding themselves. They needed to prepare for the wrath of Rome, because the Romans will be back, quite obviously. And they had time to prepare, because Vespasian didn't come back for another year. So during this time, the rebels were in charge of Judea. And it gets a bit confusing here, because there were many Jewish factions who didn't entirely agree with each other. And so we have Jesus of Gomorrah, who's in control of Galilee, but somehow not in control of Jerusalem, not sure why. And we have the more orthodox Jews, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, in charge of Jerusalem. And they are now the governors of Judea, because the Romans have gone, the Roman army has gone. They need a police force to police their region and to start building up defences against a possible Roman attack. And so they appoint Josephus Flavius, our old friend the historian, Josephus Flavius, as the army commander in charge of Galilee. And this is that period where we saw that both Saul, the biblical Saul, and Josephus were both the army commanders in charge of Galilee. That's why I say they are one and the same person, because they have one and the same lives. And this is an interesting image. This is an image of Saul, the biblical Saul, dressed in Roman armor, because he was an army commander in charge of Galilee. That is how he was able to arrest the followers of Jesus and James and commit them to prison, because he was an army commander in charge of Galilee, the same as Josephus Flavius was. So we move on a little bit to the year AD 67, and Vespasian, Commander Vespasian, enters the Levant with 3 legions. Now, some historians say that Vespasian had 60,000 men, which is, I find, unlikely. because he had 3 legions, and 3 legions is 18,000 men, plus he had a few local forces, as we saw from Sehemus and from Agrippa. So it was more like 30,000 men, but enough, you might think, to quell Judea. In fact, it was enough to quell Judea. And again, the conflict is confusing because Saul Josephus, who's now the commander in charge of Galilee, is against the Romans. He has to be because he's working for the Jewish priesthood back in Jerusalem. But he's also fighting Jesus of Gomorrah, the biblical Jesus, as I've said, who is also against the Romans. And yet secretly, Saul Josephus is actually pro-Roman. And he may have been a spy working for Vespasian at this time. You can see how these allegiances were shifting because this was half of a civil war, which is always confusing as wars go. And here's an image of Vespasian in Judea. This is on a silver coin, and you can see Vespasian's distinctive face there on the left. And on the right, you can see Judea as a captive. And this became quite a popular symbol after the Jewish Revolt, where the symbol of Judea is the person sitting down, normally sitting down underneath a palm tree, and sometimes sitting down underneath their discarded armor. And quite often these coins have Judea capta written around them. Judea captured. So we have Vespasian now in Judea, and we have some more keystone cops capers again. It's a really confusing battle, this is, the Jewish Revolt. The Jerusalem rabbis had appointed Saul Josephus, as we've seen, to hunt down Jesus of Gomorrah. But the power of this command had gone to Saul Josephus's head. And he said, as he says himself, he was aggrandizing myself to the point of glory. And the people in Galilee distrusted Saul Josephus because they thought he was working for the Romans, which he probably was, but he was pretending not to. So Jerusalem paid Jesus of Gomorrah 40,000 denarii to go and capture Saul Josephus, the person they had appointed as commander in the first place. So the hunter had now become the hunted. It gets very, very confusing. It really does. It reminds me of what Jesus said about the Jewish revolt. Jesus said, "For I have come to set a man at variance against his father, and the daughter against her mother, and a man's foes shall be those of his own household." Yeah, well, that's about the long and the short of it. Never get into a civil war. It's far too confusing. You don't know who is friend and who is foe. Anyway. Saul Josephus is still the Jewish commander of the, not exactly the rebel forces, these are the forces controlled by Jerusalem. Saul Josephus is the Jewish commander at the siege of Jotapata. It's being besieged by the Romans, by Vespasian and Titus. And Saul Josephus tries to flee the siege. And he brazenly admits to this. He says, in the third person, talking about himself, he says, "Hereupon Josephus avoided letting them know that he was going away to provide for his own safety, but told them that he would go out of the city for their sakes." The brazen perfidy and selfish egotism of this man, bragging about running away to save his own skin. But that's Josephus for you. That's how he was all the time. And he admits it quite freely in his books. And that's the reason no one trusted him or wanted to be associated with him after the Jewish Revolt. So that is why organizations like the new fledgling Christian church could not admit that their leader, their creator and leader, was actually Saul Josephus, and hence all the obfuscation that we have seen. Anyway, Josephus was made to stay in Jotapata, which was being besieged by the Romans. And the Romans took the city after 47 days, which is exactly what Josephus prophesied. And he goes and hides in a dungeon with some of his comrades, with the Romans up above, of course, and there is no way of escape. So they draw lots to kill each other. And via this lottery, Josephus manages to be the last one to die, which is obviously some form of trickery that Josephus has deceived his comrades so that he is the last one to die. So Josephus then surrenders to Vespasian and Titus, and Vespasian gives Saul Josephus a warm welcome and a guarantee of his safety. Why? Well, most probably because he was working as a spy for Rome all of this time, which is what we suspected when we were talking about Saul Josephus meeting Nero in Rome. And this suggestion is reinforced by what happens next, because Saul Josephus becomes a Roman propaganda minister working for Commander Vespasian and Titus, and urging the Jews to surrender, using their own language and their own religious tenets to try and make the Jews in Judea and in Jerusalem surrender to the Romans. So he was a Jewish quisling. He was now working for the Romans. He changed sides. Just as Saul changed sides when he had his flash of inspiration, so Josephus changed sides when he had his flash of inspiration. And why is he doing all this? Well, it might have been just pure pragmatism. He had been to Rome and he knew it was pretty futile to rebel against the Romans. But it could also be that he might have been from another branch of the same family, another prince, who was using the Romans to regain the power that he did not have. And he did regain power of all of Judea, but probably not in the fashion he thought, because he was still very much under the control of the Romans, even after the Jewish Revolt ended. Anyway, we move on. In fact, we move on 3 years to the end of the Jewish Revolt, to the siege of Jerusalem, which was in AD 70. And this was a desperate and tragic 5-month siege of this huge city, this fortress city. And then Jerusalem fell, and the temple was burned, and the people were shipped away into slavery. And what does all this have to do with the Gospels? Well, it is mentioned in the Gospels. During the siege of Jerusalem, the Romans built a wall around Jerusalem to stop supplies coming in and to stop people fleeing from the city. And so there was this enormous wall that they built all the way around Jerusalem, a wall and a trench. But Jesus, the biblical Jesus, talking to the city itself, Jesus says, "For the days shall come that your enemies will build a trench around you and compass you around and keep you in on every side." That's a perfect description of the siege of Jerusalem. And this is the biblical Jesus giving us this description, which is why theologians have to say that this was done through prophecy, because he was supposed to be dead 40 years ago, of course. But it's much easier in the context of these lectures and this research to say that Jesus was actually alive at this time and he was the leader of the Jewish Revolt. He was Jesus of Gomorrah. And we have another one. This is not just an occasional text that stands out as being incorrect. This happens time and time and time again, where all of these inconsistencies start shining through. Because when you try and change a chronology, it's so easy to forget various parts of that chronology. And so little parts of your story no longer match up with what you're trying to say. And here's another one. This is the death of Zacharias. And Jesus says, again, this is the biblical Jesus. Jesus says, from the blood of Abel unto the blood of Zacharias Barachias, who perished between the altar and the temple. Verily I say to you, it shall be required of this generation. Yeah, between the temple and the altar, which is a perfect description of the death of Zacharias Baruch. And this hasn't gone unnoticed by theologians, and the venerable theologian Adam Clarke says of this, some think this, in the spirit of prophecy, refers to the murder of Zacharias Baruch. They gave him, Zacharias, a mock trial, and, when no evidence could be brought against him, 2 of the stoutest of the zealots fell upon him and killed him in the middle of the temple. So both were murdered in the middle of the temple, and both had the same name. But again, this identification, this very, very simple identification, it's pretty obvious what Jesus is actually talking about here. He's talking about Zacharias Baruch. But this simple identification gives us a big problem, because we know when this happened. Zacharias died in AD 68 during the Jewish Revolt. That's why Adam Clarke has to say that this was made in the spirit of prophecy, because Jesus is not allowed to be witnessing this. But more rationally, Jesus was alive in the AD 60s. And here's another. They just keep coming and coming. Jesus said, "But they do all their works to be seen by men, not by God. They make their phylacteries large and extend the borders of their garments, and love the uppermost rooms at feasts and the chief seats or cushions in the synagogues." And that one's difficult to explain here. In fact, most people who read that, whether they're priests or theologians or lay people, will have no clue what it's talking about. But this is actually a direct criticism of Hakeseth Zizit, who was a rich aristocrat in Jerusalem. The phylacteries and the tassels and the cushions are a play on words with his name. And we know this because exactly the same criticism is made of Hakeseth Zizit within the Talmud. And the problem with this, why people will not make this identification, is because this aristocrat was active during the Jewish Revolt in the late AD 60s. So again and again we see this chronological chasm. The AD 30s events actually occurred in the AD 60s. But if we allow for this chronological dislocation, then this means we have found the biblical Jesus in the historical record. He is Jesus of Gomorrah, the governor of Tiberias who led the Jewish revolt. And so this is a bit of a eureka moment. We've discovered the biblical Jesus in the historical record. But there is a problem with this. There is always a problem. And the problem is we have no real idea who Jesus of Gomorrah was. I mean, he's mentioned in the Talmud many times, and he's mentioned in the works of Josephus many times. But other than that, we have no information on this Jesus of Gomorrah. We have no coins, no castles, no palaces. He's just as ephemeral as is the biblical Jesus. So all we're doing is we're trading one phantom for another, which is no good at all. We can overcome this impasse, but to do so we need a new text and a new perspective with new information. And that will come in future lectures. So I hope you've enjoyed this lecture on Jesus of Gomorrah, the biblical Jesus. Next time, we're going to look at Mary of Bethany, who is Mary Magdalene. And we're going to look at her role as the Queen of Judea during the Jewish Revolt, and her sad fate after the revolt ended. So I hope you can join us next time.